Okay, so today you are joining us for our seminar series, the Women in Global Health Exploring Non-Academic Careers. And we'll go into introduction for our speaker in just a moment. But before that, I wanted to just walk us through some house rules and a little bit about the series that you're joining, because for many of you, this is your first time with us. So as you join, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, maybe add your LinkedIn profile, certainly have conversations with each other. But please make sure that you select everyone when you do this so that your messages are seen by everyone and not just by the group of panelists here, because then you're missing out on your network opportunities. So as you introduce yourself and chat, just make sure that you've selected to everyone. And then if you find that ongoing chat is really distracting to you, just close that chat window during the seminar and you can pull it back up later. But we've definitely heard from some people that the ongoing chat and seeing all the links and everything really takes away for them from the speaker. So please just remember to close that if that is your experience. And then a reminder, please, to add any questions that you have for Grace in the Q&A box, not in the chat. Because we have so much activity in the chat, it can be really difficult to follow. So as we move through today's session, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A. And I want to take a moment as well to introduce our community. So I'm Dr. Anna Kalbarczyk. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Global Health, and I also lead our initiative on women's leadership in global health. And we have a few different activities that we do regularly as part of this community, which is not restricted to Hopkins affiliates at all. In fact, we have people today at the seminar series and people in our network from all over the world who aren't affiliated with us, other than to say, this is a topic of interest to me, and this is something that I want to explore. So as you listen to today's session, if you're interested, we do have a monthly seminar series where we feature women leaders in global health with different career paths and leadership journeys. And our goal here is really to ask these leaders to share their experiences and their careers and their journeys. We also have a virtual network on Slack with over 700 members from around the world. And I've asked Megan at the Center for Global Health today to post a link in the chat so you can join us on Slack. If you're not familiar with the tool, we also send out a weekly email to help get everyone acquainted to what's been going on in Slack, what kind of conversations there are, the different kinds of channels that you can join. We recently started a channel on mental health and burnout. So we talk about everything from looking for jobs to failures and breakdowns to our mental health. So it's a great space to share your experiences with others. And then we also have regular virtual networking events. And our next one is going to be on December 1st at 9 a.m. And that will be in the Gather platform, which is the same platform we used for our last event, though it'll look a little different. So I've also asked Megan to post in the chat a link to register if you're interested in joining us for the Global Speed Networking event. And I think right now it's more of a save the date, and we're figuring out our information, but that'll all be circulated as you're interested. So that's all I have to get us started. Please just remember, select everyone, introduce yourself, start to join this fantastic network using the links that we've posted here. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Decker from, she's one of the steering committees and advisors for this Women in Global Health initiative. Also a professor in the Pop Fam department here at the School of Public Health. And she has provided this lovely connection to Grace. And so we'll introduce her. So over to you, Michelle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am Michelle Decker from Population, Family, and Reproductive Health, and have really so much enjoyed being part of the leadership team on convening the speaker series. And Anna, thank you so much for heading this up. It's been such a wonderful endeavor. And I think when this topic is introduced, you'll see why we thought it was a perfect sort of joint seminar with our Population, Family, and Reproductive Health seminar series. When we think about sort of the interface between legal climates and policy climates, the issues of human rights, and in particular, women's rights and access to justice and safety. Many of those are the themes that are substantively woven in here, as well as thinking about the leadership skills and the leadership path that has allowed our incredible speaker to be so very impactful in this area. So I think you'll see why we thought this was a perfect joint seminar. And with that, I am just absolutely thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Grace Malera, human rights activist, lawyer, feminist, has been working in this space for almost 20 years. Just a couple of months ago, she was named as appointed and named as the Ombudsman of Malawi, effective just recently, so we'll get to hear about that transition. But Grace's leadership in human rights in Malawi and beyond dates far back, including many leadership roles in Action Aid, Executive Director of Action Aid, but most recently the team leader for the flagship program on violence against women and girls in Malawi, as well as leadership roles within the Malawi Human Rights Commission. And all of this infused within this is sort of that lens on human rights and also really tending to the needs and the unmet needs for women's rights in terms of access to justice and really fighting back against the marginalization of women and girls, making sure their voices are heard. And I am just so thrilled to have you with us here today, Grace. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn this right over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm thrilled to be here, honored to be amongst your colleagues from wherever you are joining, to share some of my experiences, some of my thoughts pertaining to women's rights promotion and protection. So speaking essentially from myself as a woman that has had to navigate all kinds of discrimination and stereotyping, I'm a young woman to where I am today, but also then drawing from my own experiences as a human rights defender, protector, and also a gender and sexual reproductive health rights expert of sorts. So I do hope that I can generate a conversation with you and also look forward to learning more from you. I will try at this point and see if I can share my screen because I prepared some presentation from which I'll be speaking. Okay, is my screen shareable?
Yes, yeah, we can see it.
Thank you. Good. So I am making my presentation, as has already been said, to really cast a spotlight on the Malawi scenario. Even though from where I'm sitting, I think maybe some of the issues that I'll be talking to will not really just be unique to professional women in Malawi, but perhaps maybe applicable to some other contexts and settings, of course, with differences. I will be drawing from my career journey to then also speak to what are the key challenges that we see in Malawi in promoting women's rights, but of course, are there any opportunities and how are we turning those opportunities into avenues, into incentives, into mechanisms, into strategies, pragmatic strategies for ensuring that women's rights are realized, because my starting premise is that women's rights are human rights. So I'm basically going to speak about my personal leadership journey, what I've learned over the years. I'll then weave into that the situation of women's rights in Malawi and of the challenges, the opportunities, and the best practices, and just share with you some of my concluding thoughts. I've already been introduced. Thanks, Michelle, for that introduction. But for purposes of going into my presentation, I would like to say something about myself that situates me into the topic that I'm sharing with you today. Number one is that I'm a mother of 3. My firstborn is now 19 years old. He's in university. So perhaps some of you can already begin to relate. This is a child I had when I was 24, and joining the working community, joining the job market. I am a feminist. This tends to raise controversy in some of the settings that I work in. For example, when I'm presenting myself to colleagues in the church, they really look at me and wonder why I would tout the title that I'm a feminist, but I am unapologetically so. And when you begin to unpack and explain that, did you know, for example, if I'm talking to a priest in my church or elderly women in my church, when you begin to unpack and you say, did you know that feminism is all about equality of the sexes, which is basically what we are preaching in the churches. They begin to warm up and they begin to pay attention. So I go out there and I have to use this label sometimes strategically to make people curious, to make people wonder and want to hear more about me. Why would you be a feminist? And then when you begin explaining, you kind of make them see things from a different perspective. I mentioned that I'm also a sister. I'm an aunt. I'm a neighbor. I mentioned that I'm a neighbor because in Africa, especially in Malawi, there's just certain obligations that are expected of you as a neighbor, as a member of a community. For example, attending weddings, social events, for example, attending funerals. This is an obligation that you have to balance between, your work and having to go and congregate with those that are bereaved. I am a daughter, so there are also expectations, and you are never too old for your, obligations that come with being a daughter of a family. And usually the settings in my country, Malawi, tend to be so communal. So pretty much the whole clan would call me a daughter. I'm not just my mother's daughter. I'm the village's daughter. They look at me and they say, oh, our daughter stays in town. And when I go back home to the village, people come and they have some expectations around me as their daughter. I am a church member and a Catholic at that. So that also brings with it some expectations in terms of, my role, for example, as someone who has to promote sexual reproductive health rights, LGBT rights. How does that sit? How does one go about navigating that space? I'm also a member of a lot of other professional bodies, the Malawi Law Society, the Women Lawyers Association. I am a human rights activist, as Michelle said in introducing me. I'm a lawyer, a human rights and gender expert. My particular specialization is sexual and reproductive health rights. I've worked in the public sector, I've worked in the civil society, and I've also worked in the private sector. And I'm also now holding the post of ombudsman. Other jurisdiction call this public protector. I have worked with the Human Rights Commission, which is a national human rights commission. And I've also worked as a team leader of a donor-funded program. What does this mean for a career woman? It brings with it all kinds of multiple identities, and it has implications in terms of a number of aspects of my life, socially, economically, psychologically, and everything else. Number one is societal expectations that are for the most part gendered. So when a child is sick, the number one duty bearer in the home to tend to that child, to make sure that the children are ready for school in time, to make sure that they've done their homework, to run and attend to a funeral of a bereaved member of the community. All that rests with me as a member of the society, as a daughter, as a mother, as a wife, as an aunt. This then brings into question the aspect of how do you strike that balance between work and then myself as an individual, myself as Grace, amidst all these kind of obligations. these identities that come with me as a woman also raises a number of stereotypes as to my capabilities, particularly when I was a young woman. I'm 43 now. I first became executive director of the Human Rights Commission when I was around 32, 33. And because of all those multiple identities, because of the time that I entered into the executive management space, I have also had my fair share of direct and indirect discrimination. My career, the legal profession in Malawi, is heavily male-dominated. It is still a boys' club, so pretty much, you know, hardcore jokes goes, some of them sexist. One has had to come into that field, and how do you navigate that space that is so heavily male-dominated? I've also, you know, this, I would say, for me, put me off from venturing into private practice when I graduated, because that was more of a boys' club. So it sort of pushed me into what would have been considered as much more softer, feminine work, which was to go and work with government, work with the public sector. Of course, for me, it was fortunately a question of passion. But you will find that even in the legal profession, when you've made it into that male-dominated space, what I've also faced is that you tend to be assigned typically feminine roles. So in my case, I remember when I was principal legal officer, which is the entry point, the junior most level for lawyers in the Human Rights Commission, when they were introducing an HIV and AIDS in the workplace program, and they needed to constitute a workplace committee on that, I was typically nominated by the executive director then to head that committee. And in reflecting back, I think that was thought as, okay, these are issues, you know, around sickness, around people's welfare. You know, who best to fill the role of leading this than a woman? I've seen this in the Malawi Law Society, where I've held positions that it became, you know, so unheard of. You would not want necessarily to vie for president of the Malawi Law Society, or let alone would you easily get a vote. So in my case, I was confined. I think there was 2 terms when I was just a member of the executive committee. But even then, your participation in those spaces tends to be limited. The meetings would be held maybe 7 p.m. after work, and the mother label, by that time you've already won it. You need to supervise some people, some little people do their homework. You need to make sure that you know, food is on the table and everything else. So even your participation, when you make it in those committees, by virtue of you being a woman, sometimes tends to be limited. And I've said that my firstborn is 19, my secondborn is 13, and my lastborn, my little girl, is 9. This means that I've had all my pregnancies and have had to go through the lactating period and everything during my career journey. While rising on the radar to make it to executive director, it's never easy, because most workplaces really are not at a stage where we can say they are providing the best or the most in terms of reasonable accommodation for situations that women only face, in this case, pregnancy and lactation. I must say that in my 17th, 16th year in my career, when I joined Action Aid, that's when I noticed that there was deliberate steps and mechanisms by organizations such as Action Aid International to be more women-friendly, gender-sensitive, and therefore there were some reasonable accommodations around how a person could extend the prescribed, stipulated 3 months maternity leave in the employment laws and everything else. In my work as a human rights activist, there is also a number of threats that I faced which were of a gendered nature. So sexist attacks, sexist comments, you being an easy target, you primarily, and I'm small in stature to make matters worse. So you can easily, and I was easily a target of some of the threats in some of the volatile periods that we worked in. This has also meant that I've had to fulfill the proverbial or the old age saying that women have got to work twice as hard. You are starting from a premise where everyone is questioning your capabilities and you are really under pressure to prove your worth. So what I observe is that men start from an advantaged position of he can do it, he can deliver. For the most part, women, it's the flip side. There's, can she really do it? Irrespective of the degrees you have presented, irrespective of how well you perform in an interview. In fact, I was appearing before a parliamentary committee the other week, and that's exactly a question a male member of parliament put to me to say, can you really assure us that you are up to this task? And sometimes you wonder if those questions are not really based on the fact that, look, you're just a woman. Okay, remember in a setting like Malawi, we've come a long way to move out of the kitchen. But even as we have moved out of the kitchen, I think for the most part, largely we've been confined to the lower cadres of the workspaces. We have been confined for the longest time to suitably feminine tasks, being a nurse, being a teacher. And I think as we have been evolving to make it into leadership positions, we start from that disadvantaged position of the questioning of, will you really deliver? Will you really make it? What does this mean? Every cloud has got a silver lining. And what I've learned over the years is that we can turn all these challenges, all the stereotyping, all the biases into opportunities. This is a space that when you claim it and when you go about with a purpose, you set your goal and you're very deliberate about showing your worth and saying, you know what? It's not about being a man or being a woman, but it's about the aptitude, the skill, the qualifications that this job requires, which I have and I'm bringing on the table. When you have navigated that, you then gain the confidence, you then gain the demand. You create a brand sort of out of yourself, and you are then able to work and also to contribute just like everyone else. I've also learned, and this is something that I do, that as women, because of all those biases and the stereotypes, sometimes it's not easy to be invited to the tables. And it's about making yourself known, raising your hand, and getting yourself onto the table. And when you're on the table, ensuring that you're working to deliver, to showcase that, look, I've got an LLB honors degree, I've got an LLM, just like the next gentleman sitting to me, and together we can work and deliver the job. So my own take on these issues is that one has got to be really deliberate and purposeful about breaking the barriers and about crashing the glass ceiling, that it shouldn't happen as an accident, but we need to know that we've got to make a claim out there that women's rights are human rights and that we're just as capable. So basically that's what has taught me from my experiences. And building on that, I then look at the multiple layers that this can then be extrapolated into the broader community. What are the intersectional issues? What are the multiple layers that women have got to deal with when faced with discrimination? And from my own now work experience, I know that women are vulnerable and are subjected to heightened discrimination because of the multiple identities that I talked about. But in this case, for the broader community, broader population, we now know that women and girls in my setting in rural areas in the context of Malawi, women and girls with disabilities, women and girls with HIV, migrant or refugee women and girls in LGBTI communities, poor women and girls, illiterate women or women with low levels of literacy, women in certain professions like domestic workers, sex workers, laborers in estates, practitioners, generally lower cadres in both the private and public sector face heightened discrimination, gender-based violence, sexual harassment. So my own experience, therefore, is that as we go into programming on women's rights issues, and I know maybe by this I'm preaching to the already converted, it requires that we be specific. We should not treat women as a homogeneous category, but be attentive. When we say women are being discriminated, which women are, where are those women situated? What's the balance in power issues that are at play? So I want then to use that premise to talk a little bit about my country, Malawi, building from the global evidence that women and girls around the world face discrimination just based on their gender. And this has not spared any space. It's in the communities, it's in the home, it's in the workplace, it's in public life. And we know that it is compounded by the different factors that I've talked about. For Malawi, we rank 173 out of 188 on the UN Gender Inequality Index. We have some of the highest rates of marriages. That's 8th highest child marriage rate in the world. Women in Malawi are likely to live in poverty because of issues of less access to land, lower education levels, low income, and limitations in decision-making power. More than half of the women have not attended school, and girls are likely to drop out of school due to early marriages. We also have numerous social norms, practices, and a very highly patriarchal society that reinforce discrimination against women and girls. And one of our highest problematic areas is gender-based violence. The forms that women's rights violations take, I think this is not unique to Malawi. We have issues of domestic violence, rampant, economic discrimination, discrimination in social and public life, sexual and reproductive health inequalities, rampant gender-based violence of all forms, sexual harassment in the workplace, oppression, sexism, prejudice, implicit bias or sexism, harmful cultural practices, and the devaluation of women's work. That's just an example of gender discrimination that current statistics show that 41% of women will have experienced either physical or sexual violence, and that 42% of our girls are getting married before 18. I spoke about the causes. We have social norms that reinforce discrimination. We have limitations with respect to enforcement of laws. And generally, we have women operating from a disempowered position. So back to my career journey, to emphasize that with time, I've worked at the grassroots level. I've worked in civil society. I've worked in public sector. And I've seen that slide of the bullet point number 5, that all the efforts that my country is making are ensuring that we are making progress in the promotion of women's rights. The indicators are improving, but maybe not at a pace that one would expect. And as one of the challenges that we see is limited awareness. People are not aware of their human rights in ways that are empowering. So in other words, I think generally people now do have a sense that, look, this is a violation of my rights, but it's not enough to do checklisting awareness raising. You need to empower people so that they would want to take action when they see that there's a human rights violation. So much of the work that has been done has not been empowering enough to let people know what services are available and how to access those services and what to expect when they get to those services. The other challenge that I have seen in my working life is that even when people are empowered to want to demand services, we just have limited the service provision, legal services, medical services, psychosocial services are really hampered. So here, what I'm sharing as a best practice is that we need to engage communities in ways that are empowering. We need to engage chiefs and religious leaders because these are the custodians of culture and custom. Remember, I've said this is actually one of the elements that reinforces discrimination against women. In my career journey, I've also worked a lot on public inquiries. This is human rights mechanisms, public inquiries, law reform processes, state party reporting processes. I've been Malawi's delegation to the UN, to the African Commission. This is a very important mechanism and tool with which we can engage to promote and protect women's rights. But the problem is that most of our laws are not really paying attention to the context in which those laws are going to be implemented. And therefore, you see a disconnect. The law is saying this, people are simply not complying because maybe you've not addressed the real cultural incentives that drive people to do some of those things. I've also seen that for the most part, there is limited follow-up to the state party reporting mechanisms in terms of whether all the recommendations that are made in those spaces are really implemented by governments. So there is a lot of challenges that are also existing in terms of what you have at the level of the law and what you have in practice. This leads to gaps in survivors accessing justice when they have faced the gender-based discrimination. We also have a lot of structural barriers in the delivery of justice to survivors, and we have a lot of material barriers. So building on this, I'm sharing as I conclude some of the best practices that we have worked with. Number one is to strengthen law enforcement processes by ensuring that there are clear referral pathways from community all the way to the district and national levels, by ensuring that systems are being strengthened, by ensuring that there's adequate resourcing, and in this case, intensifying advocacy efforts for adequate resourcing. Malawi has also done so very well in law reform to address discrimination that happens at the level of the law, but also in practice. There's just some examples of laws there that have been enacted in the last 10 years. So we are doing very, very well in that regard. We also have a very strong policy framework in which these laws are anchored or reinforcing each other. And then over the years, we also keep seeing a lot of good political will from the governments, the administrations that have been in place. We are also seeing a lot of evolution in respect to an engaged citizenry and social accountability processes. I would end my presentation by also sharing some of the best practices, some of the things that are working as we try to address the issues that women and girls face in terms of their human rights. So number one is to make sure that our programming is taking the gender transformative approach. This is where you are really looking into the social norms that drive the discrimination, that drive the gender-based violence, and responding to those social norms, but also in ways that people are becoming, their own actors of change. Gender mainstreaming is something that has worked. So what we have seen is that every other sector in the public sector, the transport sector, the water and sanitation sector, governance, to then begin to ask the gender question and to move away from gender neutral or gender blind programming to actually being cautious about the issues of women and girls. How does this project, how will it affect women and girls? How will it even boost the attendance of girls in schools? Will it ensure that there's retention of girls in schools? We are also doing a lot of programming around gender, disability, and social inclusion. So remember when I was starting, I talked about issues of multiple discrimination, issues of intersectionality. So that is a lens, gender, disability, and social inclusion, that makes you to move away from categorizing women and just saying, oh, women are being discriminated. Which women? Where are they situated? What can be the tailor-made solutions or pragmatic strategies for the specific category of women? We are also working with male involvement. This is where we need to see ways in which we can work with boys and men as partners in ending gender-based violence. And there's a lot of programming around that in Malawi. And finally, something that I'm so passionate about is the adolescent girls and young women programming, because that's where we need to focus our efforts in order to break the generational cycle. If my mom had not been educated, chances are I would not have been educated, and therefore would have been at that lower cadre of the multiple discrimination. So how do we come in and ensure that at a certain level we are empowering, we are keeping the girls in school? For those that are not in school for one reason or the other, how are we addressing issues that predispose them to early marriages, to forced marriages and everything? So it's a presentation that I had to put in a very short space of time, because it's been a very hectic period for me for the last couple of days. But this is how I would weave my career journey, my experiences as a woman, as a young woman when I went into executive management, to where I am today, and weaving that with my own work as a gender expert, but also as a human rights lawyer. I would stop here, Anna, and give the floor back to you. Thank you all so much for listening to me.
Great, thank you so much, Grace, for that talk and for sharing your journey. We have some questions coming in the Q&A, but I wanted to get us started. You know, here at the end, you talked a lot about deliberate best practices, right? When we saw your examples related to law enforcement, transformative programming, male involvement. How have you seen deliberate barrier breaking in your personal career and in your leadership journey specifically?
I think I must say I like to give an example that it's not an easy process when you're talking about gender transformative programming, even at a very personal level. You really have to be conscious about it, because for my case, I was born in a society that is highly patriarchal. So all the leadership figures that I grew up with would predominantly be men. The head teacher of my school was a man. Of course, the priest was a man. The market where we went to, the people that owned the businesses and everything else, such that that tends to become your default setting. So I like to share an example. My daughter, when she was 6, told me, "Mom, I'm drawing a truck." And I said, "Oh, that's good." And then she says, "Mom, I'm putting a driver in front of the driving seat." And I said, "Oh yeah." So she came and showed me the drawing, and behind the driver's seat, there was a picture. The drawing was that of a woman, a lady, a female. And without thinking about it, I was like, but that's not a man driving that truck. And because her generation is different from mine, she has seen her mom driving a 4-wheel. She was like, "Yes, mom, but what's wrong? This woman can as well drive the truck." And I had to immediately say, "Oh, gosh, there I go again, default setting." So it's a question of reading ourselves, number one, as practitioners of our own biases, being alive through that. As a lawyer that is going to handle a survivor's case, how do I make sure that I'm not already judging the survivor? What were you doing at 12 midnight? What did you expect outside of your home? A good woman should be in their beds. So it's about the conscious effort to us as practitioners to rid ourselves of biases. And these biases can be biases against sex workers, biases against the LGBTQ people, biases, all kinds of biases, and training service providers. So we've done a lot of training of lawyers, magistrates, judges, to work, to evolve along that continuum of personal biases. We've seen personal biases making their way into court judgments, into court rulings. So how do we program around that at a personal level, and also amongst the cadre that are supposed to provide service that is for the protection and promotion of women's rights? I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but it therefore meant also prepping yourself to face what would sometimes be cutthroat, workplace issues, competing, throwing yourself in the ring and saying, you know what, this has got to be done, and I'm the person that's going to do this.
Thank you, Grace. And I appreciated you wove a story about your daughter into that response. And one of the first things you said when you talked about your identities was about being a mother. And so we have a question from Amanda. Do you have any suggestions or strategies that have worked for you to manage the balance between your multiple identities for young mothers who are only beginning the process of balancing home responsibilities, work, and now little people who are running around?
Yeah. So Amanda, that question is very interesting, because I would imagine our contextual settings are different. So in Africa, particularly in Malawi, you are easily able to strike the balance, because we are pretty much communal. So half the time, my daughter in the afternoon maybe is off to the neighbor to play, and I know that my neighbor is watching over my daughter. Half the time maybe I'm staying with a niece, a nephew, and an aunt, and of course domestic help. So that tends to ease or help you manage the burden. But that notwithstanding, coming to me as a person, even in times when maybe I may not have domestic help, I may not have the broader communal family support, that for me, at a personal level, how it has worked is in being able to draw up a schedule of work and what I need to be doing at home, and going by that schedule, so that I need to tell myself it's 5:00 p.m. and I have to leave the office, because tomorrow is another day. Being more organized, I know it's not easy. It's easier said than done. You may be asking, Grace, what do you mean being more organized? Even in the office, delegating, making the most of our teams, irrespective of where you are in the career rather. Because sometimes, especially when you border on perfectionism, like I do sometimes, you want to do everything yourself. It's 13 hours and you want to check if the person that you had delegated to is really working on the piece, yet you are expecting it at 15 hours. Breathe, keep calm, it will come to you. So not trying to do everything at once. I know also easier said than done, but also working around a program that you can sustain with time. Setting goals. What do I want to do in the short term, in the medium term? I'm old school, so if you see my desk, it is usually littered with literally notes that I'm saying, I think today I want to do 1, 2, 3. That way I'm more structured and I'm not feeling the pressure, because sometimes you can have everything cluttered really literally around you and you really want to fix everything. So one of my favorite sayings, Amanda, admittedly, is one day at a time. That's how I would respond to that.
You know, Grace, you raised one point about making the most of our teams. And I was typing this down, just remembering that no matter where you are in your career, you are working in a team. And, you know, I think increasingly there are spaces for younger and emerging leaders to be honest with team members, what's going on, you know, where you need help. that it doesn't always have to be a team being led by a senior leader, right? That it can be, teams really working together. And that's how we work. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, and it's gotten more upvotes than I've ever seen from a question, so it must be asked. This attendee says, thank you for your inspiring presentation. As a fellow woman of color from the Global South, I've been incredibly frustrated by the global health leadership jobs in international organizations and research being disproportionately led by white women from Western countries. At my previous job at a UN organization, there was a lot of institutional resistance and denial when women of color voiced their frustration with the microaggressions that they faced from white colleagues. How do you suggest that women of color in the global health field approach this problem, keeping in mind the growing decolonizing global health movement?
Yeah, which is really a very good juncture for me to talk about the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office program, formerly DFID, that I was leading as team leader. And my personal take on that is that development work, donors, development aid has really got to put in deliberate efforts to ensure that there is inclusion of women in the Global South to take up prominent roles, leadership roles in work that is implemented in their own settings for their own people. So this really worked well for the DFID, sorry, I'll keep calling it DFID, but it's now FCDO. For the FCDO program that I was leading, they made that conscious decision to say, for a program on violence against women and girls, prevention and response in Malawi, for Malawian women, it should be led predominantly by Malawian expertise. We understand our own context. Our people relate to us. We know the cultures. We know when, things, small, minute details like who to address while standing and who to address while sitting make a difference when we are engaging communities. So this was a deliberate, and I think we really must push for this movement that let leadership take cognizance of the importance of women in the Global South being given prominent roles for programming that is happening in the Global South for women in the Global South. Secondly, in answering that question, I must state that in my own program, it is not that there was only us Malawian women working on a gender-based violence program in Malawi. We do take also cognizance that there is expertise in our counterparts, in universities across the world, in some research hubs across the world. So there was a lot of a deliberate setup where we could tap into that expertise without unduly diluting the fact that this was a Malawian program for Malawian women led by Malawian women. So there was a lot of short-term expertise programming. There was a lot of linkages. In fact, we're implementing the program as a consortium. So some colleagues were sitting in the UK, some colleagues were sitting in Malawi as Plan International, and ourselves as the lead agency that was implementing. And I think that for me was not unduly restricting. I could still be the Malawian expert with a lot of knowledge of my context, but have the linkage to draw from expertise from elsewhere. What is working in Kenya that Michelle, my colleague Michelle, will have researched in Kenya? That's not very unique to Kenya that can be brought into a similar context in Malawi. So it's also about drawing the partnerships, drawing the linkages, but in ways that are not unduly restricting you as the people that are well aware of that context, speaking and talking to that context and programming to that context. I hope that answers the question. And I do think that some of us that worked on that FCDO program really had a very good time, and we really churned out a lot of brilliant work because of the mixed expertise, but with the leadership of us as locals.
Grace, I'd like to ask a follow-up question, which is, I mean, you provided a great example there of something that worked. Have there been other collaborations or other times where you've seen Global North institutions or international organizations actually do a good job of this, of really promoting local leadership, local voices, women's leadership that's not externally driven?
Yes, I think that would quickly be my example in ActionAid International, because they actually have the right architecture in place. So what ActionAid International has done is they have localized country offices, and they have given autonomy to country offices. Country offices are run by local boards. For example, in Malawi, by Malawian experts drawn from different fields. So you are local first before you belong to the broader global ActionAid International. But you are drawing from one global agenda that you're trying to contextualize. So for example, if you would want to focus on tax justice as it intersects with women's rights, okay? That's a global agenda. How that plays out in the Malawian context with the kind of economy that we have now has to be left by us Malawian experts, drawing and tapping into the expertise of the international experts and saying, can this really work in Malawi? Are these really the nitty-gritty issues that should be for Malawi? And I would like to think that that kind of placement of work that is happening at a local level within a broader body like ActionAid International, where you're drawing from one global agenda but localizing it and contextualizing it, for me, I think was also one of the best practices. And the devolution of autonomy. ActionAid Malawi, you make decisions for yourselves. Of course, you'll be accountable to the global board, because some of your funding is being generated at the level of the global board. But you see, when I was in ActionAid, for example, that was also a very good springboard for ActionAid Malawi to say, even though everyone else is moving away from HIV and AIDS as a global issue for programming, it's still a very challenging issue for Malawi. We're able to program around that and to actually draw funding from the Global Fund and work bilaterally with the Global Fund, of course, with expertise in terms of financial management and everything else from the global efforts, from the global office. So it's about localizing, devolving power while still operating as a global community and tapping more into the different expertise that come from the different settings.
So I think both of the examples that you've given there are really highlighting successful collaboration. And one attendee I guess responded to my question, and I'll try to frame it as a question to you. They say, as a follow-up thought on Global North institutions leading the work in the Global South well, right? And then they provide a quote, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." How do you see in this global health space us bringing about genuine change?
I think there must be, yeah, I will use the same word in the question. There must be genuine partnerships. We must have balanced partnerships. And I'm not quite sure how that, as the question you are reading from, can be achieved. Sometimes it's about, what is this saying about he who does the piper? You know, so sometimes it's about who is bringing in the resources. And in this case, usually monetary resources. And then them determining the agenda. Okay, we think climate change is the issue, and this is how we're going to go about it. We're talking about, you know, climate smart agriculture and everything, and you who is working in Action Aid, in Plan International, in Malawi Human Rights Commission are saying, but we wish more women's voices could make their way into that space, but it may not be the interest of he who is bringing the pace. So I would say our focus really should be, how do we make these partnerships to be more genuine? How do we make these partnerships to go beyond he who brings the pace, but take into account the expertise that lies in the women in the global South, and treat that as also something of value that we are bringing to the table that can then get us into some equalization of that partnership. I think it would be a tall order, but we must also mobilize and push. We are not going to get that power, while seated and waiting. We must mobilize. We must push ourselves into our own research. We must say, based on this research that we have done in the Global South by Malawian women, we think for this particular problem, a solution should be able to look like A, B, C, D. Because people want evidence. On what basis are you informing this policy or informing this programming? So I think we need to keep, I know there are very good efforts at getting ourselves mobilized, but I think we need to keep at that and ensure that we are coming and pushing in without relenting until our voices are recognized, until we take our rightful places on those tables, and until we are heard and we are equally shaping the agendas. Because we do bring in a resource as well. We are the resource. It may not be monetary, but we are the human resource that they need for solutions in the Global South that are going to work for women's issues in the Global South.
Great, thank you, Grace. I appreciate the reframing too of thinking about resources and what is brought to the table. I'd like to pass our last question over to Michelle, our co-host for today's event, and then we'll do a brief wrap up. So Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much. I feel like I could talk all day about this, and I just, Grace, want to thank you for sharing so much of your wisdom and insight and your journey. Two sort of final things on my mind. I'm wondering, through all you have accomplished professionally in particular, I wonder, what are you most proud of, knowing that sometimes the achievements that are seen by others are always so useful, but sometimes the things that we hold most deeply that we're proud of aren't always the things that bubble up to the top. So that, and then what remains? What are the priorities remaining on the next, 3-year agenda for your work in Malawi on fighting gender discrimination and ensuring human rights for all?
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I think over the years, starting as a young professional in the Malawi Human Rights Commission, working with women in the villages at the grassroots, I've realized that women have got the power. It's inherent. In spite of all the obstacles, in spite of all the cultural dynamics that we are navigating, myself as an elite, my sister in the village, I think there's power within that we talk about in gender transformative programming. And all that we need to do as practitioners, as programmers, is to work with women on the recognition that we are starting from a premise where women are not passive participants. There's power within, and we need to harness, to tap into that power within to get the empowerment where I'm no longer subjected to violence. I'm no longer subjected to gender-based violence. What I'm realizing, and which gives me courage of conviction that we need to keep at this, is that women's voices can no longer be ignored. I think that's a fact. We are on the tables and we're not going anywhere. And I think going forward, we need to keep mobilizing. Sometimes it can be a long journey of we feminist activists, but make sure that we know that even at the grassroots, there they are activist women, and we need to build a movement. I think it's about movement building from the grassroots to the national level, and the work focus on adolescent girls and young women, so that from that crop, there are more Michelles that can come up. There are more Graces that can come up, and we can keep contributing as a collective and make rightful claims to our human rights, because women's rights are human rights. I don't know, I'll make that my parting shot, Michelle.
Grace, thank you so much again for answering that question and answering all of our questions today. It's been a real pleasure to have you here. And thank you, Michelle, for connecting us with Grace and for co-hosting this event with us, and everyone who's on the call today. Thank you also for joining, for asking your questions, for networking in the chat. I just want to remind everyone that our next event is going to be on December 1st, and this is our speed networking event. Megan has posted in the chat a link to register for that. She's also been posting in the chat opportunities to connect with us in our Slack network space. So we'd love to see you there to keep these conversations going about what Grace talked about today, or about any other issues that you've been thinking through in terms of global health and leadership, and maybe even intersectional identities, as Grace brought up so beautifully at the beginning of her chat, and how this all plays a role in the way that we engage in our careers, engage in leadership, and think through these issues. So thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Grace and Michelle, and we'll see you all very soon. And Grace, I think just go to the other link for the follow-up event after this.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.